The moderator for this session is Charles Duncan from Piper Jaffray. He's Managing Director and Senior Research Analyst. Dr. Duncan has more than 17 years on the sell side and has been recognized by industry sources, including the StarMine Analyst Awards, as being among the best analysts for his fundamental and timely analysis. So please join me in welcoming Charles Duncan.
Thanks, Dave. So good morning, everyone. As David mentioned, this is a little bit of a different panel. Luckily, it is not an orphaned panel by looking at the audience. It is a panel that, frankly, I was a little bit skeptical on, accepting the assignment, the opportunity to moderate this panel because, frankly, I didn't know where we're going to go with this. In the late 90s and early 2000s, when I was known, dubious distinction, as a genome giant by some folks, we had this thesis that genetic information and other, call it markers of disease, would revolutionize the discovery, the development, and the commercialization of drugs. And, despite the mantra back then of the large pharmaceutical industry, whereby most of the large pharmaceutical industry and biotech, except for perhaps one company, which we have represented here, they didn't get it. They didn't agree. They didn't like the idea of being able to identify patients that may or may not respond to drugs and right-size their commercial models around that. Well, now clearly that is what's happening with the orphan disease space, and I'll say more broadly with companies trying to identify patients that may respond to their drugs, and I think that has set up a pretty interesting business model. Yet there are some diseases that are clearly, afflicting a lot of different patients across the world in the United States that have high unmet medical need. And, we're going to hear from our panelists as to how they identify those market opportunities and how they're going about developing drugs for them. So, some real perhaps different risks, but also and strategies, but perhaps some similar ones to those that are being used in the orphan disease space. So with that, I'm going to introduce my panel members, and I'm hoping that they are very talkative, and I'm hoping that you folks in the audience have questions. Let's make this a very interactive session. Just raise your hand or throw a tomato at me, and I'll see if I can get your question. With me today is Mr. Mike Wisga, who is the president and CEO of Radius Health. We also have Marianne Andrich, who is the VP of Strategic Marketing and Planning for Esperion. And we also have Mr. Ed Mathers, who's a managing director of a venture capital firm you might have heard of called NEA. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to sit down and ask these guys what they're doing, why they're here. Ask them each to give us a little bit of an intro as to who they are and what their company is doing. Then we'll start with questions. Thanks for coming. Mike, so tell me a little bit about yourself and Radius Health.
Myself is easier. I started off in my biotech life at Genzyme, which is sort of formulated this orphan drug sort of mantra. And as you and I were talking about earlier, who knew 10 years ago it would be this fashionable now, right? But it sort of, I started there, was there for about 14 years as a CFO and executive vice president. Then we formed this company called Radius. Radius is focused on osteoporosis. Osteoporosis, as you may know, afflicts a much wider patient population than any orphan drug, somewhere in the order of 200 million patients worldwide. There's somewhere in the order of 2 million hip fractures a year, which are highly debilitating. Just some facts. If you have a hip fracture, there's a 50% chance you're never going to be ambulatory again, which is a huge burden to both the healthcare system as well as families. If you survive, and that's not assured, because somewhere in the order of 26% mortality is in the first year, and that's just to benchmark that. That's higher than myocardial infarction, diabetes, and breast cancer combined in the first year. So it's highly debilitating. The reason sort of we focus on this is because even though it is not ultra-orphan or orphan diseases, I would argue it's bending with the shift of what's going on in the market, which is highly personalized treatment and patient treatment. It's a bigger market, clearly, but it's when you come right down to it, it's a treatment of each individual patient and patient outcomes. There's not a lot of things out there that work, so I would argue it's a fairly large unmet need, but it's a highly focused market.
That's helpful, Mike. Marianne, tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at Esperion, please.
Sure. Well, I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for 30 years and have done everything literally from being at the bench top, killing rats, to isolate rat liver hepatocytes, to now being at Esperion. I've been primarily in the heart disease area and have seen the growth of statins. 20 years ago, we were at the beginning of the statin era. And back then, there were editorials and statements being made that heart disease was finally cured. We're done. And even though the rate of heart disease has actually dropped, still, while we're sitting here for 45 minutes during that time, 90 people in the United States will have had a heart attack, and another 90 will have died from coronary disease. So even though we've made a lot of progress, there's still a ways to go. In thinking about statins, one of the things that we've found as physicians and patients have had a lot more experience with them is they're amazingly great drugs, but they're not perfect. And there are a fair number of patients who are unable to take those drugs because of side effects relative to muscle. And there are estimates that hover around about 2 million patients here in the United States who need a statin, they need a therapy in order to get their LDL cholesterol levels to the established treatment goals that their physicians have for them, but are unable to take that very drug that they need. So we're developing a product at Esperion that lowers LDL cholesterol with a different mechanism than a statin. So it's designed to be used in those patients who are unable to tolerate a statin, but also can be used in combination with a statin if a physician doesn't want to raise the dose. So that's what we're doing right now at Esperion, our products in phase 2.
Excellent. And Ed, you're not running a company, but you are investing in them and have been involved in a lot of companies. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your fund?
Sure, Charles. Thank you. And thanks to Bio for having us here. My name's Ed Mathers, and like Marianne, I guess they probably went for a group of people on this panel who have been around a long time. I've been in the industry about 31 years now, I guess approaching my 32nd year in a variety of pharma and biotech related industries and on the investment side. As Charles mentioned, I'm with a group called NEA, New Enterprise Associates, and we are a fairly large venture capital firm. We have close to $14 billion under management right now. Our last fund we raised a little over a year ago, NEA 14, was a $2.6 billion fund. And what NEA does is we invest across specialties and across ranges of categories. So we are a tech, healthcare, and clean tech type fund, multinational, with investment offices on the East Coast out of Chevy Chase, Maryland, where I'm based. We have Sand Hill Road, Menlo Park. And then we also have offices in Mumbai and in Shanghai, where we're also investing in China and in India. From a healthcare point of view, our area of focus is, one of my partners calls it the dumbbell strategy. We'd like to go earlier, we like to go late, because historically that allows us to put a lot of capital to work. As you can imagine, to Due to the size of our fund, we do have to put a lot of capital into companies, so we'd like to, by going early, it allows us the opportunity to gives us visibility to put a lot of money to work in a company over time. Usually later stage companies, such as the groups here, require a lot of capital to get them through the value inflection points later. So that tends to be our sweet spot. The topic of the panel here is interesting because I think probably most of our last 5 or 6 deals have been all in the orphan space. You could argue, and I'm sure we'll get into why that's the case, but I think a lot of it's driven by less orphan, but more around personalized medicine approaches where you might be taking large classes such as the statins that historically were considered very broad, but within the personalized medicine approach, you're actually narrowing the class and what patients can actually benefit from what therapy. So it's sort of a misnomer when we say orphan space relative to the primary care space.
Excellent. Well, that's helpful, and I agree with you. Ed, I'd rather call this a panel on personalized medicine because it's an area that we've dealt with for quite some time, alluding to what I alluded to at the beginning. That said, though, I think that there are some opportunities, and I'd like to ask the panelists if they might identify some. We obviously have osteoporosis and cardiovascular medicine represented here, but first of all, when you think about a primary care or non-orphan market, what is it that makes for a primary care market? Is it simply the number of patients involved, or is some other characteristic? What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I think you're less in primary care because everything's a specialist now. I think in terms of size of the market, for me, a lot of people thought about Genzyme as an ultra-orphan company. Mm-hmm. And to be fair, we were. We also had a fairly large product called Renagel, which was for treatment of kidney dialysis. You can find a bigger market, candidly. I think the difference for me is that the size, but the focus is approximately the same. Well-defined patient population, unmet medical need, bearing down on personalized medicine in that larger market. That's what sort of separates it to me. But it's just merely the footprint and the size of the market.
Right. So even within that market, you were sharing with me that physicians were looking for ways to identify patients that were good candidates, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's how you kind of win in that market. I think there's, and I'll defer to you, Ed, a bit on this, but I think there's this mantra out there now that a smaller market, ultra-orphan markets equal smaller trials, faster drug development, higher prices perhaps. In my mind, it's kind of all balancing the same. I mean, the cost of development, drug development is approximately the same. You're just lowering the denominator and raising the numerator a bit, but the risk reward is approximately the same, I would argue, for the size of the market. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. I think 2 other additions to those points you laid out there. A much more receptive regulatory environment. Mm-hmm. Because the risk reward is different in some of these, what I call ultra rare diseases, so there might be a higher tolerance for risk relative to the benefit. Mm-hmm. And patient advocacy.
Yeah.
With the patient advocacies, the one thing as you look about it, and on a panel later today, I'm back to school, but one of the things around the primary care market, if you look at the orphan diseases right now, or the small diseases, there is usually a very loud and vocal patient advocacy group that speaks on behalf of that population. Usually it's a mother or a father who has a child inflicted by a disease and has been searching for a way to identify needing help.
That's right.
If you think about it from cardiovascular disease, Marianne, you might correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm not sure of a very vocal hyperlipidemia association, other than maybe the AHA or something else that's pounding the table at the FDA saying we need these types of trials and we need them fast. So that's another reason why it's a little bit more receptive in the orphan space.
Yeah.
Marianne, what do you think?
Well, it's interesting because from being in the space for a while and thinking about how do you reach patients, there isn't that bottom-up grassroots approach to it. There's one group called Women Heart that was an organization of women who've had heart disease, and the reason they got together was because there were so many challenges to them, because it was seen as more of a fatal disease than if it happened to a man, which was kind of interesting. But I think you're right, Ed. What happens in the cardiovascular disease space is the advocacy is from healthcare, from the providers down, rather than from the patients up. And for lipid disorder, for example, most patients are going to be presenting in a primary care doctor's office with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. It is a requirement now that every patient have their LDL cholesterol level measured. So that's going to be happening more in primary care. What happens with patients who are not tolerant to statins, you think about the typical primary care physician is incredibly busy, has a lot of patients they have to see. They don't have the time to really spend with a patient and get into the whole concept of being more personalized about the treatment options they can offer. So very often, they will refer them out to a specialist, whether it's a clinic, because there's now these freestanding clinics, or to a cardiologist, or to a lipid specialist in the community who will have the time to handle it. So, but to get back, I think, to the point is, it isn't like there are patients who are pounding the pavement saying, we need better options. It's just not happening there.
Yeah, it's interesting that if you think about marker-driven, patient identification, arguably, cardiovascular medicine is far ahead of most other disciplines, but for oncology. So it's interesting that evolution hasn't really taken place all that. I guess it's because we all have hearts, except for investment bankers. Are there any?
I knew that was coming, Mike.
Yeah. So,
but it won't be recorded, so that's good.
let me ask you, if you would wax philosophical, Ed, maybe. What are some of the key areas that you're intrigued with? You've mentioned that recent funding has gone to companies that are focused on orphan diseases, but are there any areas that are, call it not orphan disease, that you think are intriguing in terms of areas of unmet medical need?
Well, intriguing, number one out there is Alzheimer's.
Right.
Problem with Alzheimer's is the underlying cause. I mean, it's still a graveyard in terms of you don't know what you're going to treat and when to treat, and when do you get in the prodromal stages, and is it tau, is it beta amyloid,
Right.
is it acetylcholinesterase? So, but I mean, if you think about the number one disease out there in need that I would consider primary care, it's Alzheimer's. If in fact there was the identified cause, I think you would see a flood of activity. I mean, not that there isn't, because the agency has probably got it as one of the number one issues in terms of a need. So I throw Alzheimer's in there. I think also you see, in spite of continued indications, new drug approvals in diabetes. There's, on some level, you're starting to see, some of the value might be incremental, but some of these patients don't respond well, and it's a huge global burden. I think the agency is becoming, the pendulum swung very hard a few years back, given some of the tox issues in the Avandia and everything. But the re-adjudication of the Avandia data actually shows that maybe that was wrong.
Right. Right.
So, in that area, I think very important. And along those lines, I think obesity. I mean, the AMA's actually identified obesity as a disease now.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
And unfortunately, the agents that are out there, I mean, the payers haven't quite identified it as a disease yet, but I think, there's so many comorbidities associated with obesity that even I would assume hip fractures.
Absolutely. I would add to that infectious diseases too. A big market. It has been, as with any, infectious disease market, it's tough to get your arms around it. You kind of push in one area and it pops up somewhere else. There are a lot of interesting things going on, but there's no real epiphany out there yet.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Ed, I'm glad you mentioned obesity. It's an area that we've unfortunately dealt with for some time. I cover 2 of the 3, and our firm covers all 3 of the currently marketed obesity or potentially marketed obesity company drugs. And I asked someone to be involved on this panel from one of those companies, or a couple of those companies, and frankly, none of them were available. And I think that's in part because they are still grappling with what you said. They're still wondering how to move obesity drug therapy into the mainstream in terms of primary care, challenge with the reimbursement authorities. Let me ask Mike a question for you, because you're developing a drug for not a small market. I'm wondering what you see as some of the key challenges in developing a drug for a primary care market.
Yeah, well, it starts with the clinical trial, big clinical trials. You know, I would argue Radius is a bit of a dinosaur. 2,400 patient population trial. We're in phase 3 now. We have our outcomes coming out next year, all privately funded. That will, I would argue, will never occur again. That's just a big, big trial.
Big ask.
Yeah, exactly. Coming out of the other side of that, there's two schools of thought. There are some folks who would argue that once you get FDA approval, essentially you're done. Whew, made it, right? All done now. That's only half the battle. That gets you sort of the chit in the game, as it were. I think the next step to that is to figure out how to market it appropriately, how to get it to the patients that need it. There are a lot of efficient models out there. I don't think as a small company you can replicate those. You can't do it efficiently. So I think you have to be judicious on how you think about strategic partnering, leveraging those resources that are out there, creating those that don't, to make a much more efficient channel of distribution to get it to the patients for that unmet medical need. We're kind of on the cusp of that now. And models are shifting. You know, the big pharma is sort of downsizing that big detailing sales force to have it more targeted. Smaller companies are building theirs up from the bottom. So we're kind of at the vortex right in the middle there. It will be interesting as that model shifts and as we shift from what has traditionally been a kind of delay osteoporosis model to more of a build and hold model. Build up the anabolic strength of the bone, then put you on an anti-resorbative agent so that sort of smooths things out, and then put you on an anabolic again to kind of rebuild the bone again, almost modeling what your body does naturally. By doing that, that model is shifting. So you can think of some natural partners that have one half of the equation versus the other half of the equation.
Sure. Commercial partners.
Commercial partners,
yeah.
Exactly. But again, the keynote is to, how do you efficiently leverage what's out there rather than recreate it? There are many, probably some folks sitting here who say, damn it, I can do it myself. I'm here to tell you, it's extremely difficult and probably inefficient to do it yourself.
So I'm going to ask Mary Ann about that. But before I do, are there any questions from the audience? Mary Ann, kind of picking up on that theme, what do you think about emerging biopharma's prospects for going it alone in primary care? Any thoughts on that?
Well, Mike, I think you went through a lot of the issues you have to wrestle with. One thing that's helpful now is that we know a lot more about physicians. We know a lot more about their prescribing patterns. It used to be, that's why you had to have these 10,000 reps going out to detail Lipitor, just because you really weren't sure of who was prescribing what. Now we know better, so you have an opportunity to segment and identify back, because when I was a sales rep back in the mid-'80s, the mantra was 20% of your physicians write 80 to 90% of your prescriptions. And the thing was making sure that you could identify those folks.
I see.
But even getting to that requires an infrastructure to really understand who they are and who you can target out there very specifically. Companies are out there now with smaller size sales force that are targeting very specifically. So the question is, if you can have that infrastructure, it's not necessarily the boots on the ground with respect to sales representatives and medical science liaisons, but more about who's inside to help support that from an operational perspective, so that you can identify the right physicians to speak to about the right patients. And I think that's where the challenge comes in. because that whole commercialization process is so complex in really understanding who your target market is and who those physicians are and where they are. That's the big piece. Putting a sales rep out there and giving them a list of reps, a list of physicians rather, for them to go after, that's the easy part. It's getting that list to begin with that becomes tougher.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it seems to me that technology and analytics can really help change the game or right-size things. There are companies out there who can identify physicians and keep track of who they are in certain areas. Who's writing for what. Are you actively deploying those kind of technologies? And Ed, let me ask you if you're reviewing business models for that kind of technology.
Well, I guess I'll answer on the business model, and then Marianne or Michael, you can answer the other side. I mean, from our point of view, admittedly, we have not done a lot in what I would characterize healthcare IT, which is probably more of that, because a lot of it's still emerging. I mean, some of the questions, are you going to focus on the utilization, the application aspect, or are you going to focus on it, or do you want the data dumped in the cloud?
Yeah.
And then how do people access it mobilely, and then how real time is the data? So we've sort of stayed away from it right now. Not to say that we wouldn't go there in the future, but we haven't really gone very deep into that space.
Yeah, certainly the technologies are evolving, emerging, and companies are making access to you. Either of you?
There are a lot of interesting technologies out there, but again, I think what we're sort of seeing is sort of the underlying shift of how people are being treated health-wise in the United States. We're moving from what I would consider a one-size-fits-all model to something that's highly targeted, highly specific, either through the docs that are prescribing or the patients that are in the most need, or sort of, but it's more targeted than, I would say, blanket the earth detailing that used to take place in the 70s and 80s.
Yep. And the other piece of it is that when you said before, Michael, that FDA approval was really the first step, and you think about getting on formularies, getting reimbursement, that's an enormous task. Then the sales representative almost acts as in pull-through to ensure that they have to understand when they talk to a physician who they're a provider for. But that first piece on having your national account managers and folks like that going out, that's boots on the ground, where you have to approach all these various plans. You have 50 state, Medicaid formularies, and they're not alike. They're different in every state. So when you think about all that prep, that's another big piece of it, and understanding how you're going to negotiate on pricing, because we've certainly stepped away from one size fits all, and for a long time it hasn't been one price fits all. So how you're going to deal with that piece of it that's an enormous thing, I think, for a biopharma to think about. They can do it, but I think a big part is understanding just how large a task that's going to be.
I would argue that's that middle portion is more daunting than, quite frankly, the clinical trial. Engaging key opinion leaders, engaging the patient advocacy groups, understanding the pricing, getting on formulary. If you're going global, where do you roll it out first? Not England, but where do you start? Where do you end? And probably not Turkey either. So there is a scheme to sort of putting this all together to make sure you optimize the patient outcome as well as optimize the economics for the company. That chunk of work, no one really sees. But I would say that's probably double the amount of work that takes place in a clinical trial.
I can tell you historically the sell side has gotten that wrong for some time. That time.
I think to be fair, I think biotech companies have gotten it wrong too in the past. If you build it, they will come, right? It ain't that easy. There's that huge, significant chunk of work that takes place in between. That's just scary. You can't overlook it. It's the difference between success and failure.
One thing I would like, as you were talking about that, and I agree with everything that's been said here. A simple analogy is, the Jobs Act. I'll get there. a lot of people, you know, the public markets now have opened up, you know, a lot of that's been driven by the Jobs Act. You know, the ability to do the non-deal roadshows, the test and water meetings, et cetera. The SEC, you know, it took a big move to allow that to happen, but as a result, it became successful. If I take the analogy to the FDA, one of the things around pricing and everything else is you can't do anything until you're approved. Otherwise, the agency says your pre-approval promotion, everything else, but if in fact the agency would allow you to actually have these discussions, negotiate in advance, pre-approval, of course, everything's contingent upon approval or everything, you could save a lot of time. You could actually sit where the market is, as opposed to you get approved now, and of course, if you're the payer, you know, you're on the other side of the equation. You want to be able to say, oh, I'll wait, and then I'll wait a year, and then we'll negotiate price. But if there was any vehicle to allow the pre-approval, negotiation and price setting or whatever, I think there'd be a lot of differences in the uptakes of products.
Right, but how many times? I mean, you've probably seen a lot more than I have. But how many times have you seen companies that, they almost bifurcate themselves? Those that are built for FDA approval and FDA approval only, right? Marketing commercial successes later on, or those that are sort of built just for marketing commercial success. It's rare when you see them both put together.
Well, and there's a third caveat to that. There's those that are built for sale.
That's right, exactly.
We're not going to live with the problem. We're not going to live with the problem. It's we're going to sell to pharma, and that'll be their problem.
Exactly.
And hopefully, if we did enough, that pharma will buy into it.
Right.
That happens.
No, it does. It does.
On a rare occasion, I think it does. No.
But those are the ones that I put on the commercial success. But again, I think a lot of people will just stagger over the finish line with something that is approvable by the FDA and never have a whit of thought about what's beyond that.
Absolutely.
Any questions from, yes,
I just want
Denise?
to get back to the comment about having more data available, so essentially we can target and reach some of those higher prescribing deciles these days versus 20 years ago. I'm curious if, based on some of the things you mentioned, it's hard to get traction in the primary care space because there's so much to do after approval. What's your opinion on where that maybe disconnect is as far as the data and what we're seeing in the obesity space right now? Does it just, because of the things you mentioned, does it just take longer to gain traction in a primary care setting like obesity, for example?
Or is it a problem with obesity?
I think it's more. I think it's more. Yeah, I don't know much about obesity, so I'll comment on it first. I think it's more the identification that obesity is a substantial issue that needs to be addressed, rather than a behavioral issue. I think people have sort of fobbed it off as, this is easy, go away and fix it. Yeah, and more behavioral lifestyle than anything else. So I think there's that sort of the curing, that recognition that it is an issue and it needs to be addressed and addressed soon, because there's a whole bunch of, I would call it, the virtual, a flood of issues that are going to come on the back end of that unless we get ahead of it now. There's not a distinct connection between those two events. So I think that is probably more of the issue, I would argue, with obesity than the identification of key opinion leaders perhaps and getting on formulary. But
And there, because there are guidelines that are done, but I think the key point that where it's finally being recognized as a disease as opposed to a behavioral problem or a lifestyle challenge. And from a reimbursement perspective, very often it was put in the lifestyle bucket as opposed to thinking about this is a disease that is going to be in some way responsible for this person's death prematurely, whether it leads to diabetes, coronary disease, whatever that is. But it's always been looked at, it's a lifestyle choice. It's the patient isn't making good decisions. That's why they have this issue.
okay.
And we're investors, and I'm on the board of an obesity company. So I think one of the things, historically, there hasn't been any effective therapies, right? I mean, other than the ones that have been approved. Orlistat, is a risk benefit. Anyone wanted to use that also had to live with the downside of the side effect profile. So in the absence of any effective therapies, it's sort of like orphan space.
No good drugs.
Yeah, people throw up their hands. Yeah, why worry? So then there's no reason to generate the interest and the demand among the payers.
Yeah.
The agents that are out there now are effective. They hit the FDA guidelines, but there's still some side effects associated with that. So then the risk benefit becomes. I agree that now that it's a disease, I think you'll see greater attention to it. I think actually Vivus and Qsymia actually reported some data yesterday on comorbidity with diabetics, on pre-diabetics. So as the data starts to evolve, I think what you'll start to see is a greater uptake. From the agency point of view, obviously they're concerned about the teenage girl who maybe doesn't feel good about herself and therefore wants to lose some weight. So there's got to be a way to manage it and at the same time get it to the right patients. And I think over time you'll see that.
Well, and I would say that, because I've been bullish on the space, wrongly so for a while, that there is an evolution in thought going on. And Ed mentioned it in May. ACE came out with treatment guidelines. In June, the AMA came out with treatment guidelines, and we are seeing more interest by the reimbursement authorities and a broader understanding by the clinical community as to it being a disease with real clinical implications and an ability now to treat a certain group of patients effectively. And I think that's going to expand. I think there is another drug that hopefully gets over the goal line here soon. And if so, it'll be broadly marketed by a partner who has good primary care market, and I think will raise the awareness of the disease there as well, and continue to push broader acceptance of the category. Are there any? There was another question, sir, in the back.
So this takes us back a few minutes ago. You were talking about some of the financing issues. You obviously are heading a company that is running a big trial and needs big dollars, and you are a fund with big dollars that needs to put them to work. So from your perspective as a company CEO, you're, of course, looking at a cost of capital. Do I go out and sell more stock or do a convertible bond or some kind of essentially dilutive effect to be able to run your big trial? You could, of course, partner. You could do a private deal. There are many ways that you could raise those funds. And so what I'm wondering from your perspective is what are some of the critical points in which you choose to either do a partnership with somebody where you're going to dilute via the effective returns that you're going to make from the sale of that drug versus when you go out and raise capital in the market. And similarly, if I could ask you that question, when do you decide, what are some of the critical elements for you in deciding to invest on a company basis, and if there are other alternative ways that you invest? I'm just trying to get a sense of where the critical points in those financing decisions lie for each of you.
Yeah, I'll take it from my side, and then you kind of jump in. You'll notice how the group dynamics are. We have you in between, so anyway, so how I think of it is, and the good news is Genzyme. When I was with Genzyme, we did a lot of acquisitions, so I can see it from sort of both sides now, in strategic partnering. So I do get an idea of how other companies think about looking at smaller companies such as ours, and vice versa. For me, it's always that balance. If you do some sort of strategic partnering, let's say in phase 2, you get the phase 2 to phase 3 discount. Right? We all know the math of this thing. So you take whatever the number is, you multiply that by whatever 45%, and that's what you get for a number, and then off you go to the races. Frequently, because of the balance of how much money has been tossed into this thing, it kind of takes it out of the opportunities or not. For me personally, as I kind of think through it, I think it's probably appropriate for smaller companies to hold on for as long as they can with regard to the outcomes, because every step of the way, phase 2 is certainly better than proof of concept. Phase 3 is certainly better than phase 2 data. If you can prove something works, and particularly if you can prove that something works against a major competitor. So I would suggest that when I was putting together the trials, you want to think in terms of this is us against placebo, but this is us against whatever is out there as well. So you need to have sort of both. So you can prove that it's not just a me too, you can prove that it's essentially better and faster and more efficacious. If you can hold out to phase 3, that in my mind is the singular best time to have a conversation with the strategic partner. Because if I'm on the other side now, if I'm on the Genzyme side now, why would I want to pay for that risk between phase 2 and phase 3? How do I know that your trial is being done adequately? If I bring that trial in-house to a larger company, it will frequently cost more, because I've never met a clinical person from any large company that couldn't do it better, faster, and more expensively than virtually any small company out there. So I know it will cost me more. I don't have complete control of it, because somebody else is doing the work for me. So for me, the longer you can hold out as a smaller company, particularly privately, but you can also go publicly to raise capital, the better. So in my mind, phase 3 is probably the best time to think in terms of a partner, because then you actually have something to show. But Ed?
Yeah, I'd like to say it's an easy answer, and on its surface, at some level, it is an easy answer from our point of view. The way we tend to look at things let's set aside all the technical risk and science. At some point, you have to assume success in any investment you're going into, otherwise, why are you going into it, right? Then it becomes simple math. Either you're looking at a cash-on-cash multiple or an IRR multiple. Usually, the earlier you go, it's probably more of a cash-on-cash multiple. You expect a higher multiple on your return to capital by going earlier, because you can't predict the IRRs by default. It's going to take longer, so it'll be lower IRR. Later, then it becomes more of an IRR. You might look for a lesser multiple, but the higher IRR, because you're going to try and get there. Now that's the easy answer. Then if we get into the actual thinking around it, it becomes really then the amount of capital. I mean, NEA, we are fortunate that we are a big fund, but we're not going to fund a $150 million phase 3 program ourselves. We would do our significant share of that, but you need to get the right people around the table. And if you can't do that, then you actually have to evaluate the alternatives. I mean, we're fortunate. We've been an investor in a company called Intarcia since 2003, I guess. Intarcia's, we're 10 years into it now, but we've been through 3 life cycles, I guess, on it. And I think you have a board member who's the CEO of Intarcia.
We do.
But we were successful last year, where we were able to, due to the efforts of the CEO, he went out and raised the largest private round probably in the last 30 years. It was well over 150 million private rounds. We're in the middle of 5 phase 3 trials right now in diabetes. And you'd think, who the hell would go into diabetes? But and all the insiders participated. So, every situation is different, but that's just the thought process and how we go about it.
It's interesting. One of the things you said was around if you set aside the probability in because I agree with you. I think I've argued in the past that the phase 1 to phase 2 probability, phase 2 to phase 3. It's an interesting metric when you're having business discussions, but it's absolutely meaningless. You either have 100% of something, or you have 0% of nothing. So there's literally nothing usually in between.
It's interesting. So we only have a few more minutes. I have a couple more questions, not very controversial. Are there any questions from the audience at this point? So I was going to ask this question. It's not topical, but please bear with me. Mary Ann actually suggested this one, and so I'm going to give her credit because it's not a very interesting question. So what do you think?
Your good pal.
Mary Ann and anyone else who wants to chime in, please, in the room. What will be the impact of the implementation of the Affordable Care Act on needs in primary care? And I'll add, what do you think the Affordable Care Act will be implemented? That was my part of the question.
That was the interesting part of the question?
No.
That was the interesting part.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I'll start, and I'd like these guys to comment too. As I mentioned before, one of the things that's in there is that everyone's going to be required to have an LDL cholesterol measured. Other things are going to be required, and they're going to happen in primary care because it's cheaper to happen in primary care than it is in a specialty office. So the question's going to be, though, as more patients are identified, and there's more complexity associated where you're going to have someone who's got an elevated LDL cholesterol and has diabetes and is overweight. How are you going to be approaching that patient? That's one of the things we're looking at as Asperion, because if you take a look at prescribing information for statins, there's a statement in there that talks about increases in fasting plasma glucose and hemoglobin A1C associated with statin use that's been seen in some of the clinical trials. So a physician may say, wait a minute, if I have someone who has diabetes, do I want to use that? Mm-hmm. So I think what happens is they look at all these various aspects of disease process in a patient. They're going to be that gatekeeper that has been established for a while, but then what happens? I think you're going to see patients leaving primary care and going into specialty areas for physicians who are better equipped to manage, especially people presenting with multiple diseases. Mm-hmm. It's going to be easier for the specialist to deal with than the primary care.
Yeah. Is that going to raise the cost of healthcare or lower it?
If you're treating more people, and that's what it ultimately comes down to. I mean, you can look at some of the models.
Perhaps if you have better outcomes.
There you go, where you can take cost out of the system in another way.
Yeah.
And start looking at these things where, you think about when you design clinical trials to look at outcomes, you look at relative risk and you look at absolute risk. How many events are you really preventing?
Yeah.
And you can put numbers on those and start to look at, in clinical trials, what's the cost, the cost you're putting in, what's the cost you have the ability to take out?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things with the Affordable Care Act is that, because it is somewhat rote, we're not allowing doctors to become doctors anymore, where they can look at the patient as an individual and say, here are the 5 things that I would do for you, patient, as an individual. Instead, they're turning to page 53 and saying, okay, here are the things that we have to check the boxes on. And that, in my opinion, is never really a good thing. I think the balance will be found somewhere along there, but it'll be choppy in the middle.
Yeah.
I can't see how you can avoid it.
Ed, any perspective?
Yeah, I look at it slightly different, because my gut feel is it's going to be evolutionary, not revolutionary.
Yeah, I've said that too.
If you think about who's actually going to go in right now, and my gut feel is there'll be no impact on bringing new patients into the mix initially, because I think what you'll find is you'll have individual patients who are paying for private insurance anyhow, and small group plans who will want to convert, because why do they want to do that? Well, they're going to get subsidized, so they get the same thing that they got now, but it's cheaper. So as you then bring the newer patients in, to the extent you've spent a lot of time looking at it, you might be able to afford the insurance, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can afford to go to the doctor, because the amount of the co-pays at the physician level, so obviously the cheaper the plan, the higher the copay.
Yep.
And where some of these patients who are uninsured, well, they can't afford it in the first place. That's why they're uninsured. I mean, there's the young population who just don't choose to go around it. But so now you're in, you can afford to go to the doctor where you just can't afford to do anything the doctor needs to do. So really, what have you done? So I mean, it might be a little controversial in my thinking there.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think if you really want to get sort of bitter and angry on this thing, you could say that all we've really done is establish that you're going to have a lot more people in a bad system. I think underlying, you have to fix that system over the course of time. And but those are all flawed out as you put more people through it.
What about some of the concepts of clinical value or comparative effectiveness and issues like that, and like Mary Ann suggested, more patients becoming patients of specialists? Are those confounding variables? Are those things that we'll see in this evolution play out?
That's where you're going to get a cost issue coming in, because you go in, you see a primary care physician, that's going to be lower copay or no copay.
Yeah.
But the one guarantee is that going to see the specialist is going to cost the patient more.
Mm-hmm. So last question I have, if there are none from the audience, any from the audience? You might have a question as to when we're going to finish. In 4 minutes, 45 seconds, we're going to finish. But my last question is, what do you think about, so kind of flipping over to the orphan disease model, do you think the idea of developing drugs and selling drugs is sustainable to orphan diseases? I mean, what happens What's the response of reimbursement authorities if everything becomes an orphan specialist-driven disease?
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I think, well, right now it's not, I don't believe it's that big of an issue. The percentage of orphan drugs that are in the, pick it, $200,000 and up per year represents a relatively small percentage, I would argue, of any healthcare budget. As more come to the fore, it'll become bigger and bigger, and I think it will get a lot more notice. I think, as I've said, the cost of drug development doesn't really change all that much between orphan drugs and non-orphan drugs. It still costs you the same amount of time, the same amount of money, and the biologics are biologics. So over the course of time, I think between the payers, and the healthcare system, and the companies, they'll have to find a balance. They'll have to right-size this. Right now, I don't think it's as big an issue because it does represent a relatively small percentage. Over the course of time, the next orphan drug and the next one and the next one that starts charging $300,000 per patient per year, I think they have to go back and redress it.
So fad or sustainable? Marianne, Ed?
I think it can be sustainable, because when you think about where just over the past year, with respect to orphan, I'm thinking about in the lipid space, homozygous FH, so you have Agirion and then you have Genzyme. And you have folks that, even though other therapies are available, the age of death is 33.
Right.
Wow.
So when you have another option that can possibly extend that, it works, then it's something that the system is going to pay for. I was listening to something the other day where Mark Beer was talking about the fact that they don't have a lot of issues on getting paid.
Yeah.
So I think the thing is, it's the right patient with the right drug for the right disease. And I think if that lines up, then I think it can be sustainable.
Clinical value.
Yeah.
Any
Clinical
closing?
outcomes.
Any closing
Yeah, I
remarks?
think it's definitely sustainable. I mean, there are actually 6,000 categorized orphan diseases right there. We really haven't scratched the surface if you think about the approved drugs. Granted, it seems to be a fad right now, but there are plenty of these areas. And I think one thing with the orphan diseases, it's in the absence of a therapy, and we could argue the cost of them, the cost of care of these patients, whether they're dying at age 33 or they have to be institutionalized for whatever, far exceeds what some of these therapies are costing. So, I mean, and it's easier to measure. So from a plan point of view, it's like, because I know this patient, Johnny, costs me this much every year. If I put him on this one drug, I know Johnny's going to cost me X money. Right. So I think it's here to stay.
Excellent. If there are no other questions from the audience, any other questions? Well, Ed, Marianne, Mike, thank you very much for your time and your perspectives. Hopefully the audience found this to be somewhat informative, and I appreciate your efforts in this regard. Thank you.